Right, let me hand over to you. What is your second thing?
Cool. This second one's kind of building on the theme, or some of the themes from your chat with Adam Boxer recently. And I must say, Craig, I've really been enjoying some of your podcasts recently. That one with Adam was absolutely fantastic.
Oh, cheers,
and I've
mate.
almost finished your one with Peps again.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like you're back into the rhythm of like when it was like 2017, 2018, like phenomenal Mr. Barton Matt's podcast. So like I'm super excited about that.
Nice one, mate.
Love your podcast.
I think you'll like the how to plan a maths lesson has been one of my favourites I've ever done. So that's that. I think you'll enjoy that one as well. That'd be a good one.
Okay, I'll check that one. Is that one that's been come out already?
Yeah. A couple of weeks, maybe like a month ago, in between the Peps and the Adam one.
Oh, great. I'll make sure I listen to that. And I'll also add that I'm sure that you kind of asking tricky questions of schools when you're running CPD is nothing like what Adam
oh, good God.
calls out principles and be like, what you're doing is not good enough. Here's an implementation plan. And if you do not implement this, you're wasting your money. Love that guy. Can't wait to have him on my own podcast. So this takeaway is kind of building on your podcast with Adam a little bit here. And one of the things I've really been enjoying doing recently is like diving into some older resources in terms of teaching and learning. So this is a book. This one, it's like an old second library book. I don't know if you can see that. It's called The Wisdom of Practice. It's Lee Schulman. And it's absolutely phenomenal. That guy has an massive brain. But he did a bunch of research on how do medical practitioners diagnose? How do they work out what it is from all the possible conditions that they could be encountering that accurately make a diagnosis? And this is very similar to the kind of diagnosis of like what could a teacher be working on next when we're looking at instructional coaching. And there was one particular excerpt that I thought, well, that's quite an interesting idea. And it's like just a short little takeaway that I thought I'd share here as a stimulus for discussion. So I'll read a passage. Mm-hmm. The cause of diagnostic error in medical work is rarely an insufficient amount of data. Indeed, accuracy of diagnosis is uncorrelated with thoroughness of data collection. Thoroughness correlates significantly, however, with cost, a not insignificant dependent variable in modern medicine.
Wow.
What does determine diagnostic accuracy is the set of working hypotheses which define the problem space within which the inquiry is conducted. These hypotheses can be characterized in terms of their relationships with one another. The most frequently encountered relationship is that of multiple competing hypotheses, a pair or more of hypotheses formulated in such a manner that confirmation of one implies rejection of the other or others. We have come to understand the value of competing hypotheses in terms of the well-documented inabilities of human information processes to make proper use of negative information. By erecting truly competing hypotheses, it is possible for the physician to transfer evidence. I've actually cut it off, so I think it's transfer. To transfer evidence negative to one hypothesis into a corresponding positive bit of evidence for its competitor, thus permitting much more efficient use of this limited information processing abilities. So to kind of attempt to summarize that, often if we've got a hypothesis, we can often neglect information that is counter to it.
Yeah.
What does he call it there? He calls it our inability of the human information processor to make proper use of negative information. So if we go in and we're using Josh Goodrich or Adam Boxer's kind of hypothesis approach, but we only have the one hypothesis, we're likely to fall victim to essentially confirmation bias. And it's like information's coming up that's suggesting, well, actually, maybe that's not the biggest issue here, or maybe that's not a problem. But then we're just going like, oh, that's okay. Oh, there's some more evidence that supports my hypothesis. And what Schulman's suggesting here is that we actually come up with multiple competing hypotheses such that that negative evidence, which we would usually neglect, actually we can see as positive evidence for a counter hypothesis, which will enable us to weight it with more accuracy or with the weight that it's due. Now, this isn't something that I've tried in the classroom yet, because it's just something new I encountered within the last week or so in Schulman's writing, and obviously I'm on paternity leave right now, so I'm not in any classrooms. But I just thought it was a really interesting idea, and I thought you might find it interesting today as well, Craig.
I do. I find it fascinating. So I think, as I said when I interviewed Adam about how to observe a lesson, is that the two, well, his work and particularly your conversation with Josh on your podcast have just changed the game for me in terms of how I approach observations, because prior to that, I was just wandering in and one of two things was happening. Either one, I had a big preconception of kind of what was going to happen. And, I might as well not have walked in the lesson, because there's no point me seeing anything, because I already knew what I was going to talk about, whether it was diagnostic questions or whatever it may be. And that was a waste of time. And that kind of characterized much of my early kind of role as an advanced skills teacher when I used to work with teachers. When I was like 23, 24, and I didn't have a bloody clue what I was doing. And my advice was absolutely terrible. And it was that, because all I was thinking was, I wouldn't have done it like that. I would have done this. And I already knew what I would have done beforehand, and it was a disaster. So I've really tried to scrap that. But then the kind of flip, the other thing that I kind of wasn't good enough at doing was I was going in there and everything was a bit vague. So I was like, oh yeah, like perhaps could have explained that a bit better. And perhaps could have provided a bit of a better question there. And perhaps it was just kind of scattergun. Nothing was kind of done. I'd not seen anything in great depth or anything. And then when I listened to you and Josh, and then when I read Adam's work, and then my subsequent conversation with Adam, I'm really sold on this idea of this hypothesis model, because as I kind of described when I spoke to Adam, and I think this really came across when you chatted to Josh, if you kind of form this hypothesis and then you were able to kind of present some critical evidence to kind of support the hypothesis, it really facilitates that kind of coaching conversation afterwards. It makes it that you get buy-in to it much better. But, and this comes straight to your point now, I think I need to kind of now take things to the next level, because there are two things that I'm now doing wrong, I think, when it comes to observations and hypothesis. The first is definite confirmation bias. So I tried to explain this to Adam, and he was having a go at me about this, is that I'll see something. So for example, a teacher will give some instructions and I'll think, you know what, I bet half the kids aren't listening to these instructions because the teacher's giving them whilst they're giving out bits of paper and stuff, and the kids aren't thinking about them. And I think, you know what, half the kids haven't heard this. And then I'll ask 3 kids and they'll know exactly what the instruction was. And I'll as I said to Anna, I'll be dead annoyed, because I think, well, that's blown that. And then I'll seek out one kid who perhaps hasn't listened. I think, oh yeah, there it is. There's my evidence that I needed. But that's terrible, right? Because as you say there, and this comes to my second point, whilst I'm putting all my attention into kind of collecting this evidence, there's probably loads of other really interesting things happening that I should be paying attention to, loads of other evidence that's floating my way, and I'm completely ignoring those. So they're the two things I need to get better at. And this sounds really interesting, this Shulman's work. So I need to get better at avoiding this confirmation bias, definitely, and kind of not getting fixated on one hypothesis, as Adam said, for my own ego. And then secondly, I need to find a way to stop ignoring this other evidence that's coming. And it sounds, I mean, what's the takeaway here, Al? Is it to kind of go in with kind of 3 or 4 hypotheses kind of ready to go before the lesson, and then start almost like like they're written down on a sheet and you kind of bullet pointing evidence that suits all of them? How do we practically make this work, do you reckon?
Well, interestingly, I think that's kind of what Shulman did. Now, he just refers to it in words in this book, but I just spent like $100 to buy some old book from the 60s or 70s on 8
Nice.
books that it's hard to find. That's actually all about his more detailed work on medical diagnosis. And I think they actually had like a whole page of like hypotheses and like cues, and these cues were like weighted, and they mark off the cues of the presence of the strategy or hypothesis, and then it's like, then you sum the column or sum the rows and find the one with the highest sum, and that's the highest probability, diagnosis or something like that. So I think there is some way to do that. I'm not sure if that's the best, or I'm not sure if that's just what they did to more understand explicitly what the diagnosticians were doing implicitly. It may more be a case of that. But I'm not sure about going into... Well, I suppose you do go into a classroom with all the hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
And all the hypotheses you have are limited and also enabled by the extent of the knowledge that you have about teaching and learning. And if you only have a limited amount of knowledge, then you can only have a limited set of hypotheses. But if you have a lot of knowledge, then you can have a vast set of hypotheses. And then you're going to very quickly narrow it down within the classroom. But I guess maybe here I was actually just thinking while you're talking, what does this mean for what you practically do in the case, for example, where you're like, oh, they were unclear instructions, the kids aren't going to understand it, and then you kind of find counter evidence. In that case, what would be the counter hypothesis? Well, the counter hypothesis might be the teacher's done so much great work in establishing norms of participation and routines in this classroom that they don't have to give clear explanations anymore, because they're so that could be the counter hypothesis. So then you could be looking for evidence for that counter hypothesis when you survey the first 3 kids and you find out, oh, they all know what they're doing. Then the 4th kid, instead of looking for more evidence that they did a bad explanation, you could actually say, how did you know what to do? And they say, oh, Miss did this with us 20 times. And so maybe that's how to use Schulman's advice in this context.
That's good. Yeah, this is another I'm going to have to think about, because as I said, this is a big part of my work at the moment, and I want to get as good as I can to help support teachers. And I just, certainly the kind of confirmation bias, this is a big thing that's holding me back at the moment. So right, competing hypotheses. I love that, Al. That's good. $100 on a book, that's good, that as well. That's dedication. I like it.
Yeah, it's important. Knowledge is power.
Right, mate.
It's expensive.